The morning mist hung thick over the Ardennes forest on December 15, 1944, as Private First Class Thomas Muller adjusted his rifle strap and peered into the silent woods. The American 89th Infantry Division had been holding this quiet sector for weeks, and the men had grown comfortable with what they believed was a dormant front. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their routine patrols, unaware that across the fog-shrouded forest, over 100,000 German soldiers were preparing for what would become Hitler's last desperate gamble. General Dwight Eisenhower had spread his forces thin along the Western Front, confident that the Germans were too weakened to launch any significant offensive. The Ardennes, with its dense forests and winding roads, seemed an unlikely place for a major assault. American commanders viewed it as a rest area for battle-weary troops and a training ground for green recruits, fresh from the States. This miscalculation would soon prove nearly catastrophic. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, despite his private doubts about the operation, had assembled 3 German armies for Operation Watch on the Rhine, later known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, the 6th Panzer Army led by General Joseph Dietrich, and the 7th Army commanded by General Erich Brandenburger were poised to strike through the Ardennes toward the port city of Antwerp. Hitler's plan was audacious: split the Allied forces, recapture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a separate peace. The German buildup had been masterful in its secrecy. Radio silence was maintained. Troop movements occurred only at night, and elaborate deception measures concealed the massive concentration of men and materiel. Panzer divisions that the Allies believed were refitting in Germany had been secretly moved to assembly areas behind the Siegfried Line. The Germans had even positioned loudspeakers, playing recorded sounds of construction work to mask the noise of tank movements. As referenced in Stephen M. Brose's comprehensive work Citizen Soldiers, American intelligence had dismissed reports of German troop concentrations as merely defensive repositioning. The overconfidence bred by recent Allied successes in France had created a dangerous blind spot in military thinking. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harper of the 28th Infantry Division noticed increased German patrol activity in his sector, but his reports were largely ignored by higher command. The Americans had grown accustomed to German defensive tactics and failed to recognize the signs of an impending offensive. Radio intercepts suggested increased enemy activity, but these were attributed to routine troop rotations rather than preparation for a major assault. The weather favored the German plan perfectly. Heavy cloud cover would ground Allied air power, neutralizing one of the Americans' greatest advantages. Snow and fog would provide concealment for the attacking forces, while hampering Allied reconnaissance. The German meteorologists had predicted these conditions would persist for several days, giving the offensive precious time to achieve breakthrough before Allied air superiority could be brought to bear. In the German lines, Sergeant Hans Kruger of the 1st SS Panzer Division checked his Panzerfaust one final time. He had survived the retreat from Normandy and the fighting along the Siegfried Line, and he knew this would likely be Germany's final throw of the dice. The young soldiers around him, many barely 18 years old, represented Hitler's last reserves. They had been told they were launching the offensive that would turn the tide of war, but Kruger harbored no such illusions about the ultimate outcome. The stage was set for what would become the largest battle fought by American forces in world war. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the forest erupted in fire and steel. Private Muller was jolted awake in his foxhole as the ground trembled beneath him. The German artillery barrage, involving over 1,600 guns, tore through the American positions with devastating precision. Searchlights mounted on German tanks reflected off the low clouds, creating an eerie artificial moonlight that illuminated the chaos below. The initial assault struck along an 85-mile front from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. The Americans, caught completely off guard, struggled to comprehend the scale of the attack. Communications lines were severed, command posts destroyed, and entire units found themselves isolated and surrounded. The carefully planned German offensive achieved complete tactical surprise. General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps bore the brunt of the attack. His forces, spread thin across the extended front, were overwhelmed by the concentrated German assault. The 106th Infantry Division, composed largely of inexperienced troops, found itself facing battle-hardened SS Panzer divisions. Within hours, 2 entire regiments of the division were surrounded and would eventually be forced to surrender. Captain James Morrison of the 14th Cavalry Group watched in horror as German tanks emerged from the morning mist like steel phantoms. His reconnaissance unit, equipped with light armored cars, was no match for the massive King Tiger tanks and Panzer IV models that rolled through their positions. The distinctive whine of German tank transmissions and the thunder of their guns announced the arrival of Germany's most elite armored formations. The German plan was unfolding with frightening efficiency. General Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army achieved the deepest penetrations, advancing rapidly toward the Meuse River. His forces bypassed strong American positions and exploited gaps in the defensive line, using the classic German tactic of Schwerpunkt, concentrated force at the decisive point. Villages that had been quiet for months suddenly became battlegrounds as American defenders struggled to establish coherent defensive lines. In the village of Lanzereth, 18 men of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 99th Infantry Division found themselves facing an entire German division, led by 2nd Lieutenant Leilbock. These soldiers would delay the German advance for nearly 20 hours, disrupting the enemy timetable and earning themselves a place in military history. Their small action demonstrated the impact that determined defenders could have on even the largest offensive operations. The weather continued to favor the Germans. Thick fog and overcast skies kept Allied aircraft grounded, while snow covered the movement of German armor. American commanders, accustomed to overwhelming air support, found themselves fighting blind. Radio communications were jammed or interrupted, making it difficult to coordinate defensive efforts or call for artillery support. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, initially dismissed reports of the German offensive as a limited spoiling attack. The speed and scale of the German advance seemed impossible given intelligence estimates of enemy capabilities. It would take precious hours before Allied commanders understood they were facing Hitler's last major offensive of the war, by which time German spearheads had penetrated deep into American lines. SS Colonel Joachim Peiper's battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division advanced rapidly toward the Meuse, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. His tanks and armored vehicles moved with the ruthless efficiency that had made the SS Panzer divisions feared throughout Europe. Peiper's men were under orders to reach the Meuse within 48 hours, regardless of casualties or consequences. The American response was initially chaotic, but began to organize as the day progressed. Individual units, cut off from higher command, fought desperate delaying actions that gradually slowed the German advance. Engineers destroyed bridges and blocked roads, while artillery units fired over open sights at approaching tanks. The American soldiers' adaptability and fighting spirit began to assert itself, even in the face of overwhelming odds. December 17, 1944, dawned with the same leaden skies that had favored the German offensive 30 miles behind what had been the front line just 24 hours earlier. A convoy of American vehicles crawled through the Belgian countryside. Near the crossroads village of Malmedy, Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, unaware that German spearheads had already penetrated deep into Allied territory, was moving to new positions when their world exploded in gunfire and terror. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper's armored spearhead had been racing westward since the offensive began, and his lead elements intercepted the American convoy at the Bonnes Crossroads, just south of Malmedy. The Americans, equipped with trucks and jeeps rather than combat vehicles, were hopelessly outmatched by Peiper's Panzer IV tanks and half-tracks. Within minutes, the convoy was destroyed and over 100 American soldiers were taken prisoner. What happened next would become one of the most notorious war crimes committed against American forces during World War II. The German soldiers herded their prisoners into a field. Adjacent to the crossroads, SS troops positioned machine guns, while the Americans stood with their hands raised, expecting to be processed according to the Geneva Convention. Instead, at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the machine guns opened fire on the defenseless prisoners. Private First Class Homer Ford from Battery B watched in horror as his comrades fell around him. The initial burst of gunfire killed dozens instantly, but many Americans threw themselves to the ground and played dead. German soldiers walked among the bodies, shooting survivors in the head with pistols. The sound of single shots echoed across the field as SS troopers methodically executed the wounded. Ford lay motionless beneath the body of a dead sergeant, feeling warm blood seep through his uniform. The massacre lasted nearly 30 minutes. When the German column moved on, 84 American soldiers lay dead in the snow-covered field. However, several soldiers had survived by feigning death, including Private Ford and Staff Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens. These survivors would later escape and report the atrocity to American forces, sparking outrage throughout the Allied command structure and strengthening the resolve of American troops to fight without quarter. Word of the Malmedy massacre spread rapidly through American units as survivors reached friendly lines. The news had an electrifying effect on Allied morale, but not in the way the Germans might have expected. Rather than terrorizing American forces into surrender, the massacre hardened their determination to resist. Orders were issued throughout the American forces. No SS prisoners were to be taken alive. The character of the battle had fundamentally changed from a conventional military operation to a fight for survival. Colonel David Pergrin of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was among the first senior officers to learn of the massacre. His engineers had been preparing defensive positions around Malmedy when survivors stumbled into their lines, bloodied and traumatized but alive. Pergrin immediately reinforced the town's defenses and prepared for the German assault he knew was coming. The engineers, originally tasked with construction and demolition, would soon prove their worth as infantrymen. The massacre at Malmedy represented more than just a war crime. It symbolized the desperate brutality that characterized the German offensive SS units, indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and fighting for a cause they knew was lost. Showed little regard for the laws of war. The killing of prisoners was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of atrocities committed. During the Battle of the Bulge, Piper's battle group continued its advance toward the Meuse River, unaware that their actions had galvanized American resistance. The SS colonel, a veteran of the Eastern Front where such brutalities were commonplace, may not have understood the impact his troops' actions would have on American morale. In the brutal calculus of the Eastern Front, the execution of prisoners was routine. But Western Front warfare had maintained at least some adherence to international law. General Eisenhower used news of the massacre to steel Allied resolve. In communications to his commanders, he emphasized that this was no longer merely a military campaign, but a fight between civilization and barbarism. The Supreme Allied commander understood that the German offensive represented Hitler's last desperate attempt to avoid total defeat, and that failure to stop it could prolong the war indefinitely. By December 19, 1944, the German advance had created a dangerous salient in Allied lines, but the American response was beginning to crystallize around several key defensive positions. None was more critical than the crossroads town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division had been rushed to establish a defensive perimeter. Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe knew that holding Bastogne was essential to disrupting German supply lines and preventing the enemy from reaching the Meuse River. The paratroopers of the Screaming Eagles had been refitting near Reims when the German offensive began. Within hours of receiving movement orders, the division was loaded onto trucks and rushed toward the Ardennes. These were veteran soldiers who had jumped into Normandy and fought in Operation Market Garden, but they arrived in Bastogne with minimal winter equipment and limited ammunition. The speed of their deployment meant that normal supply procedures had been abandoned in favor of getting combat power to the critical point as quickly as possible. Major General Heinrich von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps had been tasked with capturing Bastogne as part of the broader German offensive. The town sat at the intersection of 7 major roads, making it a crucial transportation hub for both armies. Luttwitz understood that his advance toward the Meuse would be severely hampered as long as American forces controlled Bastogne, but he also knew that a prolonged siege would drain resources needed for the primary objective. The initial German probes against Bastogne began on December 20th. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division and Panzerlehr Division tested American defenses, while the bulk of German armor bypassed the town to continue the advance westward. This decision would prove crucial, as it allowed the Americans time to strengthen their defensive positions and organize supply efforts. General McAuliffe used these precious hours to position his forces and coordinate with artillery units that had escaped the initial German assault. Staff Sergeant Donald Hubler of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment exemplified the determination of the Bastogne defenders. His company held a section of the perimeter near the village of Foy, where they faced repeated German attacks supported by tanks and artillery. The paratroopers, armed primarily with rifles and bazookas, learned to use the terrain to their advantage, turning every building and hedgerow into a fortress. Hubler's men knocked out several German tanks with well-placed bazooka rounds, proving that infantry could still prevail against armor. When properly positioned and motivated, the siege of Bastogne intensified on December 21st as German forces completed their encirclement of the town. Supply became a critical issue for the defenders, who were running low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The weather continued to prevent Allied airdrops, forcing McAuliffe to carefully ration his resources while maintaining an aggressive defense. The general knew that passive defense would only delay the inevitable. His forces needed to maintain offensive spirit even while surrounded. On December 22nd, General von Luttwitz sent a surrender ultimatum to the American defenders under a flag of truce. The German message demanded the honorable surrender of the encircled town and threatened annihilation if the Americans refused. McAuliffe's response became legendary in American military history. After consulting with his staff, the general replied with a single word, "Nuts." This defiant response, when translated for the German emissaries, left no doubt about American intentions. The psychological impact of McAuliffe's response extended far beyond Bastogne. When news of the exchange reached other American units, it became a rallying cry that embodied the spirit of resistance against the German offensive. The simple word "nuts" represented everything the American soldier stood for: irreverent courage in the face of overwhelming odds, determination to fight regardless of circumstances, and absolute refusal to surrender. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuz of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment coordinated the defense of Bastogne's northern approaches, where his battalion faced some of the heaviest German attacks. The paratroopers had turned the town into a fortress, with interlocking fields of fire and carefully prepared positions that maximized their defensive advantages. Every approach to Bastogne was covered by multiple weapons, and the Americans had positioned artillery observers who could call down devastating fire on attacking German forces. The defenders of Bastogne represented more than just military units. They embodied the democratic values for which the Allies were fighting. These citizen soldiers, drawn from every corner of American society, had traveled thousands of miles to fight against fascist tyranny. Their stand at Bastogne became a symbol of the free world's determination to resist totalitarian aggression, regardless of the cost. December 22nd, 1944, found General George Patton pacing the floor of his 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, France, his normally immaculate uniform wrinkled from a sleepless night spent planning one of the most audacious military maneuvers of the war. When Eisenhower had called for a counterattack to relieve Bastogne, every other Allied commander had estimated it would take weeks to reposition their forces. Patton had shocked the room by promising to attack within 72 hours, a feat that would require turning his entire army 90 degrees and advancing through some of the worst winter weather in decades. Old Blood and Guts, as his men called him, had been itching for a fight ever since the German offensive began. While other commanders saw the Battle of the Bulge as a crisis, Patton viewed it as an opportunity to destroy German forces that had conveniently concentrated themselves for annihilation. His Third Army had been preparing for an offensive toward the Saar Basin when the Bulge erupted. But Patton immediately recognized that the greater prize lay in the Ardennes. The general's aggressive instincts and his army's mobility would prove decisive in the coming battle. The logistics of Patton's maneuver were staggering. 3 entire divisions, the 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry, had to be withdrawn from their current positions, resupplied, reoriented, and launched into attack in the opposite direction. Supply officers worked around the clock to stockpile ammunition, fuel, and winter equipment. Roads that had been quiet supply routes suddenly teemed with convoys moving north toward the sound of guns. The Third Army's staff, trained by Patton to expect the impossible, rose to the challenge with characteristic efficiency. Major General Hugh Gaffey's 4th Armored Division spearheaded the relief effort, their Sherman tanks churning through snow-covered roads toward Bastogne. These tankers had fought across France with Patton's Third Army, earning a reputation for aggressive tactics and rapid movement. Now they faced their greatest challenge, breaking through prepared German defensive positions. In the worst possible weather conditions, tank commanders peered through periscopes fogged with condensation, while drivers struggled to maintain traction on icy roads. The German forces blocking the approaches to Bastogne were formidable opponents. Elements of the 5th Parachute Division and parts of the Panzer Lehr Division had established defensive positions south of the town, knowing that any relief effort would have to come through their sector. These were veteran troops who understood how to use terrain and weather to their advantage. They had positioned anti-tank guns to cover all likely avenues of approach and prepared secondary positions in case their main line was breached. Combat. Command A of the 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, made first contact with German forces on December 23rd near the village of Bernin. Abrams, who would later become Army Chief of Staff, demonstrated the aggressive leadership that characterized Patton's commanders. His tanks and infantry fought through a series of German defensive positions, using fire and maneuver tactics that gradually wore down enemy resistance. The advance was measured in yards rather than miles, but it was steady and relentless. The weather on December 23rd brought the first clear skies in a week, allowing Allied air power to finally enter the battle. Fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force struck German positions around Bastogne, while transport aircraft dropped supplies to the surrounded defenders. The sight of Allied aircraft overhead boosted American morale while demonstrating to German forces that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Air supply missions flew through intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver ammunition and medical supplies to McAuliffe's paratroopers. As historical accounts from the United States Army Center of Military History detail, the coordination between Patton's ground assault and Allied air power exemplified the combined arms doctrine that gave American forces their decisive advantage over German opponents. Staff Sergeant Charles Boggess of the 37th Tank Battalion would earn his place in history as the first soldier to make contact with Bastogne's defenders. On December 26th, his Sherman tank broke through the final German defensive line and linked up with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. The siege of Bastogne was broken, but the battle for the Bulge was far from over. Patton's relief had prevented a German breakthrough, but eliminating the salient would require weeks of additional fighting in brutal winter conditions. The relief of Bastogne represented more than just tactical success. It demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of American forces under extreme pressure. Patton's rapid response had prevented German forces from achieving their strategic objectives, but the cost in men and material had been enormous. Tank crews who had been fighting for days without rest continued to push forward, knowing that their comrades in Bastogne depended on them. The American warrior ethos, forged in the crucible of combat, had passed its greatest test. By December 27th, 1944, the character of the Battle of the Bulge had fundamentally changed. What began as a German offensive aimed at splitting Allied forces and capturing Antwerp had devolved into a desperate fight for survival. As American forces gradually gained the initiative, the relief of Bastogne marked a psychological turning point, but the German salient still extended nearly 50 miles into Allied territory, and eliminating it would require sustained offensive operations under the most challenging conditions imaginable. General Eisenhower had restructured his command to deal with the crisis, placing Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in temporary command of all forces north of the German penetration, while General Omar Bradley retained control of forces to the south. This decision, controversial among American commanders who resented British control over their forces, nonetheless provided the unified command structure necessary for coordinated counterattacks from both flanks of the salient. The weather had become a crucial factor in the battle's outcome. After weeks of overcast skies that favored German operations, clear weather finally allowed Allied air power to assert its dominance. The 8th and 9th Air Forces launched massive attacks on German supply lines, airfields, and troop concentrations. Fighter bombers prowled the skies above the Ardennes, destroying German vehicles caught in the open and making daylight movement nearly impossible for enemy forces. The Luftwaffe, despite committing its remaining reserves to Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, could not match Allied air superiority. Major General James Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division attacked German positions near the town of Vilsam, seeking to reduce the northern shoulder of the salient. These paratroopers, like their comrades in Bastogne, had been rushed to the Ardennes with minimal winter equipment but maximum fighting spirit. Gavin's men faced elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps in terrain that favored defenders, but their aggressive tactics gradually gained ground. Each village became a battlefield as American forces fought house by house to dislodge German defenders. The German position was becoming increasingly untenable. Fuel shortages plagued armored units that had expected to capture Allied supply dumps, while ammunition stocks dwindled under the weight of sustained combat operations. SS Colonel Joachim Peiper's battle group, which had advanced farther west than any other German unit, found itself surrounded near the village of L'Église. After destroying his remaining tanks and equipment, Peiper led his surviving men on foot back to German lines, leaving behind the vehicles that were supposed to spearhead the drive to Antwerp. First Lieutenant John Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Allied commander, served as an intelligence officer with the 71st Infantry Division during the final phases of the battle. His unit participated in operations to eliminate German forces that had been bypassed during the initial retreat. These mopping-up operations, while less dramatic than the Siege of Bastogne, were equally important in restoring Allied defensive lines and preventing German infiltration units from operating behind American positions. The human cost of the battle was becoming apparent as casualty reports reached higher headquarters. American forces had suffered over 75,000 casualties, including nearly 9,000 killed in action. German losses were estimated to be similar, but the Wehrmacht could not afford such attrition with Soviet forces simultaneously advancing on the Eastern Front. Hitler's gamble had not only failed to achieve its strategic objectives, but had also consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. Supply difficulties plagued both armies as the battle entered its final phase. American logistics units worked tirelessly to maintain ammunition and fuel supplies to forward elements, often under German artillery fire. German supply lines, constantly harassed by Allied air attacks and partisan activities, could barely sustain defensive operations. The Wehrmacht's inability to capture significant Allied supply dumps had doomed the offensive from its inception, as German planners had counted on captured resources to sustain their advance. Technical Sergeant Vernon Baker of the 370th Infantry Regiment exemplified the individual heroism that characterized American performance throughout the battle. When his company was pinned down by German machine gun fire near the village of Kleimbach, Baker single-handedly eliminated 3 enemy positions and rescued wounded comrades under intense fire. His actions, typical of countless soldiers throughout the Ardennes, demonstrated the fighting spirit that ultimately proved decisive in the battle's outcome. The Battle of the Bulge was approaching its conclusion, but German forces continued to resist stubbornly as they were compressed back toward their original positions. Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal until it became obvious that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of Army Group B. The Führer's reluctance to face reality had cost Germany its last opportunity to influence the war's outcome. While Allied forces prepared for the final advance into the Reich itself, January 25, 1945, marked the official end of the Battle of the Bulge as American forces of the 1st and 3rd Armies linked up near the Belgian town of Houffalize, completely eliminating the German salient that had threatened to split Allied forces. Just 5 weeks earlier, the final phase of the battle had been a grinding affair, with German forces conducting a skillful fighting withdrawal, while American units pressed forward through deep snow and bitter cold. The Belgian Allied lines had been erased, but at a cost that sobered even veteran commanders who had grown accustomed to the arithmetic of modern warfare. General Dwight Eisenhower surveyed the battlefield from his command post, reflecting on the lessons learned during 6 weeks of the most intense fighting American forces had experienced in the European theater. The surprise German offensive had exposed weaknesses in Allied intelligence gathering and defensive planning, but it had also demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that made American forces ultimately victorious. The Supreme Allied Commander understood that the Battle of the Bulge represented more than just tactical victory. It had eliminated Germany's last strategic reserve and opened the path for the final Allied advance into the heart of the Reich. The human cost of victory was staggering. American casualties totaled over 81,000 men, including nearly 19,000 killed in action. The First Army alone lost more men during the Battle of the Bulge than in any other single campaign of the European War. German casualties were estimated at similar levels, but for the Wehrmacht, these losses were irreplaceable. The cream of Germany's remaining armored and infantry divisions had been destroyed in the Ardennes, leaving only poorly equipped Volksgrenadier units and hastily trained recruits to defend the homeland. Captain Charles MacDonald of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, who would later write one of the definitive histories of the battle, witnessed the final German withdrawal from positions his company had been attacking for weeks. The retreating enemy soldiers appeared exhausted and demoralized, a stark contrast to the confident troops who had launched the offensive 6 weeks earlier. Many German prisoners expressed relief at being captured, knowing that continued resistance would only prolong their suffering, without changing the war's ultimate outcome. The strategic implications of the German defeat were profound. Hitler's decision to commit his last reserves to the Ardennes offensive had fatally weakened German defenses along the entire Western Front. The panzer divisions that might have contested the Allied crossing of the Rhine lay destroyed in the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. More importantly, the offensive's failure had convinced many German commanders that further resistance was futile, leading to the collapse of morale that would characterize the war's final months. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, issued orders for his forces to refit and prepare for the crossing of the Rhine. The divisions that had borne the brunt of the German offensive were given priority for replacement personnel and equipment, but many units remained significantly under strength. The veteran soldiers who had survived the Battle of the Bulge carried with them a hard-earned confidence that would prove invaluable during the final campaigns of the European War. The political ramifications of the battle extended beyond military considerations. The German offensive had temporarily disrupted Allied unity, with tensions arising between American and British commanders over tactical decisions and command arrangements. However, the successful defense and ultimate victory had strengthened the Grand Alliance by demonstrating that democratic nations could respond effectively to totalitarian aggression. The cooperation between American, British, and other Allied forces during the crisis had proven that the Western democracies possessed both the military capability and political will necessary to defeat fascism. Staff Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division, whose unit had participated in the final reduction of the German salient, reflected on the transformation that had occurred in both armies. During 6 weeks of bitter fighting, the American forces that emerged from the Ardennes were seasoned veterans who had proven their ability to adapt and overcome under the most challenging circumstances. The German army, once considered invincible, had revealed the limitations that would lead to its ultimate collapse. The Battle of the Bulge entered American military folklore as the largest battle ever fought by United States forces, involving over 600,000 American personnel at various stages of the campaign. The heroism displayed at Bastogne, the massacre at Malmedy, and countless individual acts of courage became part of the national narrative about World War II. Veterans of the battle would carry their experiences for the rest of their lives, knowing that they had participated in one of the decisive campaigns that secured freedom for future generations. The victory in the Ardennes opened the final chapter of the European War. Within months, Allied forces would cross the Rhine, overrun Germany, and accept Nazi surrender in a Berlin bunker where Adolf Hitler had committed suicide. Rather than face the consequences of his aggression, the Battle of the Bulge had not only helped bring peace to Europe, but had also demonstrated the values and determination that would shape the post-war world. The hard-fought victory in the snowy forests of Belgium and Luxembourg had proved that free peoples, when united in common cause, possessed the strength to overcome any tyranny.